We do have a little bit of a change this morning. As per some of the concerns that were expressed at our annual general meeting, we've been able to ensure that we could broadcast this live. So our meeting will be broadcast live and recorded as well to our YouTube page. And so I will just jump right into the disclaimer. Board of Directors, staff, guests, and members of the public are advised that the SCRCA special meetings and authority board meetings are being video and audio recorded and are being live streamed to the authority's Facebook and website. As such, comments and opinions expressed may be published, and any comments expressed by individual board members, guests, and the public are their own and do not represent the opinions or comments of the full authority and or the SCRCA Board of Directors. The recorded video of the full authority meeting is not considered to be the official record of that meeting. The official record of the authority meeting shall consist solely of the minutes approved by the Board of Directors. The chair will be asking for opposition only on the couple of business items that we have today. If you oppose, please raise your hand and hold it till the chair acknowledges you. When speaking, remember to maybe say who you are as you begin to provide your comments. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Take it away.
Thank you, Brian. Ashley, can you do a roll call, please?
Certainly. John Brennan.
Here.
Al Broad.
Here.
Pat Brown. I believe he has sent his regrets, but just in case. Terry Burrell.
Here.
Bill Dennis. Bill Dennis. I don't see Bill. Joe Fox.
Here.
Larry Gordon.
Present.
Aaron Hall.
Here.
Frank Kenneth.
Here.
Brad Loosely.
Present.
Betty Ann McKinnon.
Present.
Kevin Marriott. Kevin Marriott. I don't believe Kevin is here. Nettie McEwen.
Here.
Mark McGill.
Here.
Dan McMillan. Dan McMillan. I don't believe Dan is here today. Steve Miller.
Here.
Frank Nemchek.
Here.
Lori Scott.
Here.
Mike Stark.
Present.
And Jerry Westgate.
Here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ashley. Apparently we have a quorum. At this time, I'd like to welcome everyone to the special meeting so that we can deal with the audited statements and so can I have a mover and a seconder that we adopt this agenda for today's meeting? Lori and Frank Kenneth. Any opposed? Motion's carried. It's requested that each director declare a conflict of interest at the appropriate time on any item within this agenda, in that the director may have a pecuniary interest. Okay, I'll ask for a mover and a seconder so that we can put the St. Clair Region Conservation Authority's acceptance and recommendations of the executive committee and report from the authority's auditors and MNP, Chartered Professional Accountants, LLP, and further approves the 2020 audited financial statements. Can I have a mover and a seconder, please? Okay, Mike and Mark. Is there any opposed? Is there any questions on the audited statement, I guess? Or do Ashley or Jordan have a presentation?
I can definitely walk through the statements at a high level first, and then we can go into any questions, or we can go through questions, whatever's preferred.
Okay. What's everybody in favor of going ahead with a presentation? Anybody opposed to that? Okay, go ahead, Ashley.
Okay, perfect. So just quickly walk you through the statement. So we have concluded our procedures pending approval today to finalize the audit. I can confirm that we have remained independent throughout our procedures and are issuing an independent audit opinion in draft form right now. We have given a clean opinion that the financial statements do present fairly within the public sector standards, the financial position at the end of December 31st, 2020. Looking at page 1, the statement of financial position. So the authority ended the year with total financial assets of just over 6.4 million. Financial liabilities just over 2.1 million. So the net financial assets of those two figures was just over 4.3 million for the year. Total non-financial assets, which includes the tangible capital assets of the authority, was just over 16.8 million. So the sum of those two together is the net assets of the 21.2 million that the authority had at the end of December 31st, 2020. And that can be broken out between the reserve funds and that is invested in those tangible capital assets, which you'll see at the bottom of that page. The next page, page number 2, provides more detail on the reserve funds themselves and the activity that has taken place within the funds during the year. So the reserve fund portion of that surplus is just over 4.3 million. Looking now to the statement of operations, which you'll find on page 3. So just highlighting the total revenues for the year. So just over 8.4 million in revenues for the authority, offset by expenditures of just over 8.7 million. As a result, there was a deficit of revenues over expenditures of 347,191 for the year, which reduced the accumulated surplus to that 21.2 million that we looked at on the first page. The next page shows a reconciliation of the net financial assets from the opening to the closing and all activity that has taken place within that for the year, as well as the tangible capital asset activity to come to those closing balances that also relate back to that first page that we looked at. The last statement is a statement of cash flows. So this is a reconciliation of where the cash was spent during the year between your operating, capital, and investing activities within the organization. So we take the opening cash balance, taking into account all transactions to come to the closing cash balance for the year. The remainder of the statements consists of the notes to the statements, which are standard within the requirements of the public sector accounting requirements and also specific to the authority. There hasn't been any significant updates with regards to those beyond noting the COVID impact, which is a note that you will see within the organizations that are presenting financial statements at this time. So at this time, I will open it up if there's any questions within the statements or the notes themselves.
Al, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Chairman Joe. Just a question on the outstanding accounts there. It's showing that a write-off of 47,793 seems like a very large amount. And how old are those outstanding accounts?
Can you confirm the page that you're looking at, Alan? Just so I'm
Sure. I don't see a page number. It's in the back. It's in the last couple pages.
It's the audit findings, page 4.
Sorry.
Okay.
Thank you.
okay. So with respect to the audit findings, there's a number of items that were identified but not adjusted within the financial statements. So that schedule you're looking at is items that have been identified as possible misstatements, but management has chosen not to adjust. And because they are below our materiality threshold, we're able to still give a clean opinion on the financial statements.
And maybe that'd be a better question for staff, what would be involved in those outstanding accounts?
Tracy, can you provide some insight there for us, please?
Sorry, through you, Mr. Chair. I've just got to pull up the report that you're looking at just so I can see the details. Can we go to the next question and I'll come back to Alan if that's okay?
Sure.
Okay. Mike, you had a question?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I submitted a question via email in order to allow the auditor to research if research was necessary. So I'd like to read that question. Typically, behind the final report of an audit, there exists a ratio analysis including various tests associated with the asset versus liability position of an organization. With respect to that or any available analysis, and again, I'm assuming that there is an analysis, this question is relative to note number 2, section G, and there's 5 components. Where does the SRC, and that I should say relates to reserves. So relative to note number 2G, where does the SCRCA rank versus other authorities in terms of the recommended reserve positions? In other words, the total reserves versus total assets as a percentage. Number 2, what is the optimal ratio as described above? 3, what does the province identify? Does the province identify the definition of a healthy ratio? 4, does any individual SCRCA reserve represent a concerning ranking versus the comparatives? And 5, as auditors, would you offer an opinion on the current individual or cumulative reserve positions? Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. So I can jump in for that. So definitely some great pieces there. And I think as a board, are very important that you are, having those discussions around the reserves. Within the authority, the reserve fund themselves are related to specific projects that you have identified and look to, build up to have that funding going forward, versus a general percentage of operations that you might see in some operations and some entities. So keeping that in mind for the reserve fund piece of it, and looking at those based on the projects that are funding, and monitoring, how that piece of it is going. So I would say in discussions throughout the engagement and with management, some items that we might want to, further discuss around that would be in relation to the planning reserve, which is meant to cover legal costs. So you'll see if you look at the schedule for the reserve funds there, which is on page 2. You'll see that the planning reserve itself had been depleted in 2019, and there was some additional funding added to that allocation in 2020. So that would be one for sure to kind of monitor and ensure that any potential legal costs would cover through that reserve in and of itself. The other one that, to probably watch, and I know there's lots of discussions around it, is related to the administration. And within the administration, the authority sets forward some capital items within the budget piece and funds that. The administration has also been funding the operational losses for the past couple of years as well, which in turn is depleting the capital component. So I know in discussions with Tracy and Brian, there has been some applications made to try and get additional funding to have kind of a more thorough capital asset management plan to better forecast out the capital requirements, and look at setting up, additional capital component reserve, and then keeping more of the administration at the operational level. So, kind of highlighting at a high level, those two reserves. And I know that there has been a lot of discussions at the board level as well on those items and approval, looking at potentially obtaining consulting work on that capital asset plan around that piece of it. So in terms of the reserve piece of it, definitely agree. It's a great question, and you know, something that you'll want to definitely monitor. And those are kind of the key ones that I know there's been a lot of discussion around as of late, and just looking to make sure that those are, you know, adequate to cover any future expenses in those areas.
Mike, go ahead.
Thank you for that. Your description really led to the question in general, and I was more interested in the question that I asked that you didn't answer, and that is the comparison to other authorities, and finally, on a global basis, do you as an auditor consider the overall reserve position to be a healthy, particularly by comparison to other authorities?
Okay. Yep. So definitely in the comparison piece of it to other authorities, and providing any stats around that piece of it would be kind of outside of the audit engagement itself, which is to present an opinion on the historical information, and also, you know, discussions with management about these items and the future viability of the organization. But looking further at, you know, an analysis within different different authorities, given that there are 36 authorities within the Conservation Ontario piece of it, and knowing that each authority is very different in terms of its operations and what they're doing, it would be very challenging to have, you know, a comparison that would provide a lot of meaningful comparison directly to each one of those reserves. I know Conservation Ontario historically had looked at doing some benchmarking. The last report was back around 2017 in that nature. So it definitely is challenging to have kind of a apples to apples comparisons with the conservation authorities, given their operations are so different and varied between each authority. Like definitely in your authority here, you guys have a large amount of shoreline work, which can fluctuate, you know, various year to year. So you'll see on the statements we have here, there's quite a large swing in the revenues as a result of that additional shoreline levy for that piece and that work that's being done. So my answer around that would just be that, you know, the comparison and the ratios and, you know, reporting back on operations of other CAs in comparison to this piece of it would be out of scope of the audit, and that it would be, you know, very difficult to have that apples to apples comparison given the varied operations you'll see within that piece of it. Definitely, you know, a discussion that could be held again at Conservation Ontario level to see if there is, you know, plans to do additional benchmarking between all the authorities on a go-forward basis, as well as the last time they did that, like I said, was several years ago. And, you know, that might provide some good information as well to all the authorities within Ontario if they were to kind of look at doing that piece of it. But I know even, you know, they found that a little bit of a struggle to get items to align given the varied operations that there is within the authorities.
Mike, are you okay with that?
Yes, thank you. I guess if the benchmarking that you referred to in 2017, and this would probably be more directed to the staff, if there's value in those statistics, I would like to see what those benchmarks presented, particularly if they're updated. Thank you.
Okay. Lori, go ahead.
Thank you. In relationship to the questions that Mike asked, if you were to do a year-to-year comparison of our audited statements of what we've done in the past, how do we compare to that with reserves and other things? Taking into consideration, of course, COVID has cut down a lot of things. Do we compare to last year, for example, or the year before? Like, are we in a relative good position in that respect or not?
Yeah, I think for the reserve funds too, it's important to look at them on kind of a line by line basis as well and monitor that way. So if we look kind of further there at page 2, and looking back to what the operations were for the past couple of years. So there have been operational losses within the year, which we know is kind of cutting into the administration piece of the reserve fund and bringing that side of it down as well. So, you know, definitely there's been more work within the shoreline project in this year comparison to last year. So it's hard, again, to kind of compare year to year, just because there will be those swings within your conservation authority for the different work projects that are being done. And because shoreline work is so capital intensive, that's where you're going to get those huge swings as well. Yeah, definitely, you know, comparing from that piece of it, you'll notice right on the statement of operations, there's the huge increase in revenues and offset with the capital project for that expense as well. But we do know that those operating losses have been, you know, reflected within the administration fund, and any, you know, work around the capital projecting that you guys are hoping to do within that full asset management evaluation, looking to come from there. So in the future, you know, having that more fulsome idea of those ongoing capital projects that are going to be coming to compare against to see, you know, is the reserve sufficient to cover that? Do we need to look at any additional items or, you know, potential funding to help cover those offsets as well? And then also with the planning reserve, so you can see it started out the year in 2019, like ending 2019, being depleted, and with the additional funds going into there in 2020, that is positive to help kind of replenish and get more funds back in there to help cover those costs going forward. So I think it's important as well to look kind of at the opening and closing and the activity through the year. And within the activity through the year as well, we would look to the minutes and approval of those transactions that are happening through the reserve funds. That's all approved at the board level to make sure that is consistent with those operations as well as part of our procedures.
Thank you.
Okay. I don't see any other hands. Is there any other questions? Okay, Brian, go ahead.
Just maybe to, in getting back to Mike's questions, and certainly something outside of what Ashley would be able to do a report on, the reserve information from each authority, as Ashley said, is very diverse, all over the place. We in particular are looking at capital reserves that we have. We don't have an operating reserve. Effectively, we've been abusing the administrative center reserve to offset those operational losses. However, what I can provide is that we can look at the annual statements, which are all posted online of other authorities. I will not say that we would collect them all, because it'll be a little bit of work to try and pull all this information together. But certainly maybe comparing the ones that actually have reserves, because unfortunately I know there are several authorities that do not have reserves. They just aren't in the financial situation to have that, and others that have had to significantly deplete their reserves in the last few years. So I will do my very best to provide a report back for April that gives us a little more information on that, and not necessarily specific to what our reserves should be, but at least to provide the information back to you about what the comparisons are.
Okay, that's good. Okay, Frank Ennis, go ahead.
I guess further onto those unadjusted differences, I know we've got a question outstanding yet about the accounts receivable, but just wondering about the others as well. Are they going to be adjusted, or could we get a report on, you know, sort of the rationale for not adjusting those things if that's going to be the case?
Brian, did you want to take that?
If Tracy's been able to pick up her documents, she can maybe give us a better idea.
Okay.
Yes, you, Mr. Chair. I actually had it. It took me a little longer to get it up because systems were not cooperating this morning. Must be a little tired. So with the number that Al Broad had asked about, the 47,793, that is specific to some farm rent that we are still waiting for the legal process of probate on. We have put it on our accounts receivable as a collectible because as we invoice it, that's where we record it. And then at about mid-year, we've been to a court case or reviewed a court case to see kind of where it's collected. We still have not heard anything. So this is why it goes on there adjusted. The auditors adjusted form, they make the allowance for it because we're not sure whether we're going to be able to collect it or not at this point. So that's why that 47,000 is on there. The payroll accrual overstatement is an error that's identified. Difference in, timing or something got picked up that shouldn't have, does happen. Misstatements in accounts receivable, that was a, we invoiced for some services to Upper Thames and they didn't have the funding to support that. So we're still kind of working through that with them. And then the misallocation of wages from Department 100 to 176 was actually in the prior year. So it was adjusted within this year, but opposed to going back and restating last year's statements. That's why it was done in this year and it wasn't found until after the year end. So just to reiterate what Ashley had indicated, we talk about these adjustments and we decided because the number of accounts that it affects and the amount of time to go back and redo the statements from both perspectives, and it's under their materiality. That's why we don't make that adjustment.
Al, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Chair Joe. So I guess that's a good reason if we're going to be renting this ground out that we may have to change what you're doing. We should maybe be getting the money up front. There's no reason why we should be taking a hit on that. And I know it's not very unfortunate. I understand the farmer wanting to pay half up front and half when he finishes, but based on that past experience and that dollar amount, I think our policy needs to be that the money comes up front and then we're not chasing anybody. Thanks.
Okay, Mike, you had a question?
Just a comment or with respect to Brian's comment on reserves. I don't want staff to be spending a lot of time on reserves where the money flows in and flows out, i.e. the shoreline protection. I mean, when there's grants involved, which have to be matched by the municipality and don't affect the asset value of the authority, there's no sense spending a lot of time on that. I'm worried about where we are fiscally by comparison to other authorities, and it's those reserves that I'm concerned about. Thank you.
Okay. Brian, go ahead.
And absolutely, I appreciate that, and we will definitely provide information back on those reserves. If I may, again relating to Al's question, unfortunately we had one of our tenant farmers pass away, and that's where this comes from, unfortunately. And it is in court because, of course, as part of settling up his affairs, etc. So it's a little more messy than that, but I do agree 100%. We normally do receive a payment in June for 50% of the rent and the remainder in November. So we could look at potentially changing that. I know we try and work with our tenants as best we can, but we could maybe update that to 60/40 or something along those lines, and we could provide a report back on that with with some options going forward. We are currently just in the first year of a five-year agreements. So it might be something that we might have to look at undertaking or implementing at the conclusion of these agreements as well.
Okay, Al, go ahead.
Yeah, and thanks for that clarification, Brian. That makes a big difference on that information that you just provided. I just didn't want it to be a common problem where we're chasing renters, but this is definitely a unique situation, and do appreciate the update on that. Based on that, then not really sure there is a need to change our policy if that's the case. So, but thank you for the update.
Okay. I'm not seeing any other hands. Is there any other questions regarding the audit? Thanks, Ashley and Jordan, for taking time to be with us again today and to explain your findings in the audit. So thanks again for coming. We have a mover and a seconder for the acceptance of the audited statement. Is there any opposed to it? Seeing none, that motion's carried. Is there any new business coming before the board this morning? Brian, go ahead.
Mr. Chair, I have to report that we, as all conservation authorities, I think we provided some interpretation of the newly proclaimed aspects of the Act from February 2nd, and maybe misinterpreted the meaning of some of the specifics regarding the term limits for chair and vice chair. It's been made clear that any appointments for municipal members, be they elected or non-elected, will continue to the end of whatever that appointment was. So this specifically affects Dan McMillan, and because he was appointed for 4 years, Dan will be able to finish his term on the board. With regards to the chair and vice chair, what the government brought forward was that there would be a term limit for chair and vice chair positions, that they would have elected annually, but would have a maximum of a 2-year limit for their term of office. When we received the proclamation and the what had been brought forward by the government, there was belief and interpretation from Conservation Authority staff that this would be from February 2nd moving forward. We've now received information from Ministry of Environment and Conservation and Parks staff that it is effectively retroactive. So unfortunately, this means that we are not in compliance right now with the Act as specifically changed last month. We have our existing chair and vice chair who are each now into their 3rd year in these positions consecutively. They were acclaimed effectively at our annual general meeting, and we basically need to resolve the fact that we're not in compliance. I do believe, and I will ask both Larry and Joe to speak with this, I certainly believe that there's a little more to the understanding of what goes on at the chair and vice chair levels. Certainly reaching out to the Conservation Ontario and the board for that organization, as well as specifically dealing with provincial staff and elected officials on particular items. I truly believe that a 2-year term will not provide you with an opportunity to educate yourself for these positions. However, that certainly is something that you as a board will be determining. It's certainly something that I believe we should be incorporating into our bylaws moving forward, that whatever decision is made, whether it be for an additional length of term or something else. So in order, I guess, to circle back around in summary, because we aren't currently in compliance, there are opportunities for us to request an exception from the minister specific to either one time or an ongoing change beyond that term limit of 2 years. Certainly, I believe that good democratic process and an annual election for chairs is very important and vital. And therefore, if anyone else is seeking the position, that opportunity is there on an annual basis. But would very much like the board's input as to whether they would wish to request an exemption beyond 2 years, and if so, what that exception would be, whether it be 3, 4, 5, etc. Maybe the last thing that I would put into the conversation here first, we have had chairs, multiple chairs that were in place for a decade. We've had more recently, they're a little shorter term, but it's still 4 years-ish for the most part. It actually averages out. We've had nine chairs prior to Chair Joe, and they average out to over 6 years each. And I think in a lot of cases, we went without elections due to the satisfaction of the board with the current chair and vice chair's operations. So, Mr. Chair, if I could ask for maybe some additional discussion, and then I can provide you with a potential motion that might satisfy things moving forward.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Brad, you had your hand up, but was it for this discussion or another new business?
It was for other new business, Mr.
Okay.
Chairman.
Okay, John, you're on this topic, or sorry, Mike?
I'm not sure if John was ahead of me, but I'm prepared.
It doesn't matter. I'll go after you.
You were,
My only comment was, in order, there's two questions really that Brian presents. One is that we're out of compliance currently, and two is the issue of the longer terms. So if it is possible to bring us back into compliance, why don't we just flip the roles? Why don't we retain the knowledge of the vice chair and the chair by flipping the roles and keeping the two people in place, but in different capacities. So I offer that as an option. On the longer term issue, I think that just needs a discussion. I needs a discussion at a regular council meeting or a regular authority meeting that will undoubtedly require a resolution, which I don't think under a special committee, under a special meeting such as we are in now, would in fact be considered legal.
Lori, you're next.
Mike or John Brennan was before me.
Well, your hand was up before John's.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Okay, all right. I'm just wondering if we were caught out of this, or were all of the conservation authorities in the same boat. Like ABCA, for example, has had the same chair for a number of years as well. So, I mean, we're not the only one that was caught in this? Like, okay, so this is a major thing all the way through all conservation areas right now. Okay, thank you.
Okay, John.
Okay, I'm just wondering if the intent of the regulation coming from the province is to basically give individuals on conservation authorities an opportunity to step into the role of chair and diversify that. If that's the case, I understand what they're doing. But what we could ask them would be that in a situation where no one else is putting their name forward to become the chair, why not just allow the current chair, if we want to have them by acclamation, to step into that role?
Brad, you're next.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple things. I think, first of all, I certainly would like to see our board comply. I think Councillor Start had a good idea as far as flipping them, and I have no problem with that. It's unfortunate, and I agree with Brian that, 2 years isn't a lot of time to learn the process. And I know that with this personal experience, it takes time to work with staff, and there's a lot more work involved with the chairman and the vice chairman. But I certainly think I want to comply. I want to build the respect back up with our conservation authorities, so we're not into games. But again, I don't have any problem flipping the two positions back and forth, but I do want to be able to say that we're in compliance. Thank you.
Okay. Brian, you had a comment?
So as far as just in response to Lori, there are a handful of conservation authorities who had changes in chairman and vice chairman, so they don't have an issue. Virtually all of the others have an issue in some way, shape, or form, and are requesting exceptions of the minister to resolve those, at least in the short term. My thought on the actual change in term would be to resolve that not only today, but moving forward. But as I said, we are not alone in annually electing a chair. There are some other authorities who have chosen to modify that themselves, and to the point of having some of them electing a chair for the entire term of municipal council. So putting someone in place for 4 years effectively rather than 1, and not necessarily having that opportunity for that annual election of the chair and vice chair. I truly believe that that is more where this issue comes from. John mentioned the fact that if this is specifically just trying to pass the torch around the table, then that's one thing. But if no one else wants the job, then yes, that can be specifically an issue too. But I truly think that this was specifically brought forward because of some of these, I hate to throw them under the bus, but some other authorities that have changed the annual election procedures in the recent past.
Al, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Chairman Joe. I have no problem with asking them so that we conform with what's going on there. And that will give our staff, and I think Brian and staff can sit down and draft up a bylaw. And to John's point, there is in that bylaw, we need to put in there that, come at the general meeting if there is no additional people that want to be chairman or vice chair, that those, as long as it's fine with those two that are there now, that they move forward. And I think if we put that in a bylaw form and we send that bylaw off to the ministry and have them just okay the bylaw, that's what we're going to do. But I think for right now, rather than switching the chairs around and stuff, I think we just ask them to let's conform with what's going on, ask for a little extension on that, and allow staff the time to bring a bylaw forward that we can move on to them. Thanks.
Betty Ann?
Yes, I agree that the province has mandated the council term to be 4 years. So it would make sense to me that we could comply just by asking for it to be the term of council, 4-year term, if they want it. And I'd rather ask for forgiveness than try to outthink the province at this point in time.
John, you had your hand up as well, did you?
No, I was just reacting to the emergency alert.
Okay, that's fine. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, thank you. I'd be willing to ask for an exemption too, especially when it sounds like there's other conservation authorities in the same position. All we can do is ask and see what happens.
Okay, and was that Terry, you had your hand up, sorry.
Thank you, Chairman Joe. Yes, I think that perhaps what we need is really maybe this is kind of hitting us all new here. If maybe we could have a report for the April meeting, and maybe by that time there'll be a little more sorted out throughout the province, because it's obviously not just our conservation authority that's being affected by this, and perhaps there'll have been some dialogue with the province how they want it to be looked after, and maybe we just ask staff to bring a report, because I know, having been a vice chair before, I know the chair's position takes up a lot more time than the vice chair normally. So I think that just flipping the roles isn't always necessarily the best solution, although it certainly is one. But maybe a report from staff would be the best for the next meeting. And if you need it, I can make that a motion.
Okay, I have a motion. Do we have a seconder for that? Steve Miller? Is there any discussion on that motion? Is there any opposed to the motion? No, the motion's carried then. Okay, we'll have staff prepare a report and then go from there on it at the next April meeting. Does that give us enough time to figure that out, Brian?
I think so. We will maybe hear back from some of the other requests for exception that have been put forward. I am aware of at least a half a dozen that have already been submitted. So it might put us in a better position to understand exactly what we should be asking for as well.
Okay, no, that's good. Okay, go ahead, Darren.
Thanks, Chair Joe. Just a quick question to Brian. What understanding that we're not in compliance right now with the act. Is there any immediate consequences to that? Is there anything that understanding we're not in compliance, but is there any waiting till April? Is there any kind of negative consequences that we could anticipate from that?
Go ahead, Brian.
I don't believe so. I don't see any. There really isn't any negative impact that's going to come out of this. I do think that resolving this sooner than later is maybe preferred. However, at the same time, I certainly understand the request that the board be fully informed, able to make a proper decision. And as I said, we might be able to get a little bit better handle on things if there are some approvals that come out of the minister's office as well.
Right. Thanks for that. And I just want to make a comment as well. If we do eventually ask for this exemption, I think given the situation that we're in right now with the pandemic, to me, it's not really the time to be making a shift. If that's just a comment to make, I guess. If we can keep things the way it is, especially during these uncertain times, I think that that makes a lot of sense for our board. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Laurie, go ahead.
I think if the government can throw a wrench in our workings and who we are, I think we can throw a wrench back. If somebody all of a sudden decides the snap of their fingers that everything's going to change, I got news for them. Life doesn't work that way. So they're just going to have to put up with it until April.
Go ahead, Frank Kinnis.
Yeah, actually, I was just going to say the same thing. There's nothing wrong with pushing back a bit. We don't have to roll over and play dead. So I'm all for pushing back a bit. So.
Okay. I'm not seeing any other hands. Any questions? Brian, go ahead.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, there is one more issue, piece of information. We've been asked as authorities to provide the minister with agreements if there have been any changes to the membership apportionment that is laid out in the Act. And that basically says that if you have less than, if your municipality has less than 10,000 individuals residing within your portion of the SCRCA watershed, for those that are broken up, you can have a member on the board. If you have more than 25, more than 50, your membership increases. So more than 50, we have 3 representatives from the city of Sarnia. More than 25, we have representatives from Chatham-Kent, Strathroy-Caradoc, and St. Clair Township. Everyone else has a single representative, save we have 2 municipalities that have co-representation, and they are both via agreement. Enniskillen appoints the representative from their board or their council, and that person also becomes the representative for Oil Springs. Southwest Middlesex has a different agreement with the township or the village of Newbury, and they actually have a cycle where Newbury has its own representative sit for 1 year. And Mark, you're going to have to tell me, I don't know whether we changed it when we went to a 4-year municipal cycle, but I can't remember whether it's 3 in 1 or 2 in 1. We have been requested as authorities to provide any of these agreements or potentially council motions back to the minister to confirm how that membership has been altered somewhat or even slightly from what's specific to the Act. And I guess I will be contacting municipal staff from each of those 4 municipalities just to try and make sure I get my hands on the paperwork moving forward to provide that information to the minister's office.
Okay, is there any questions to Brian on that item, or can we just leave administration to deal with that? Lori, go ahead.
I'm just wondering if there's a memorandum of understanding or this agreement, why we wouldn't have a copy on our books anyways, because it makes sense that you should have a copy of the stuff that goes on with anything that affects the St. Clair.
And if I may respond, Mr. Chair, we may very well have a copy. I know there are, as I have tried to go back through documents, I'm not having as much success. I would love to say that I was able to put my hands on it. These agreements have got some maturity to them, so I'm hoping I'm able to find that. But if it has to go back to council motions, I might be asking the CAOs at your municipalities to do that same research, and I prefer not to. But if I have to, I might well have to ask them as well.
Cool.
Okay. Is there anything else that you have, Brian?
That's all. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the board hearing those issues that we brought forward.
Okay. Brad, you had your hand up for a non-agenda item.
I did. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know we've been working on the idea of having these meetings live. Is that now completed? And again, that also puts us into compliance to do that. Is that now done, Mr. Chairman?
I'll pass that over to Brian and give us an update on that.
We are currently live on YouTube. Yes, if you actually, I know we're on different formats, but if you look in the top left-hand corner of your screen, it does identify that we are live on YouTube.
Brad, go ahead.
But does that, just for clarification, so does that mean someone can listen to the meeting as we speak, or is it posted later on in the afternoon?
It is live as we speak. So anyone can go to our YouTube channel, and there isn't a required registration or anything. It's wide open to the public that they can listen and watch our beautiful shining faces as we have our meetings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. Okay. Is there any other new business? I see no hands. Ashley and Jordan, thanks again for being with us today, and thanks to everyone for coming out in this special meeting this morning. So can I have a mover and a seconder that we adjourn this meeting? Okay, Terry and Mike, is there anybody opposed? Seeing none, motion's carried. Thank you.